Doctors. Can't live with 'em, can't live without 'em. While the medical profession is far tamer and more regulated than it has been in the past, and doctors need to go through years of training to prove they have what it takes, when's the last time you saw one of them shrink away from the sight of an apple? It is a truth universally acknowledged that even today, the medical field is janky. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We've come a long way from the days when you could implant goat testicles into human testicles, sell it as a cure for not being able to have children, and get away with it. In fact, there was a time not too long ago when, if you were a particularly enterprising figure, you could not just implant goat testicles into human testicles and get away with it, but also become a nationally respected figure for doing so. People would line up out your door, seeking to have pieces of goat sewn into their tenderest bits. Dr. John R. Brinkley did all of that, and in the process, invented basically every trope of the modern scammer and conman, and he is, of course, who I'm going to be talking about in this episode. I'm Tor Parsons, this is my co-host Jollibee the Durian, and welcome to another wild episode of Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. John Romulus Brinkley was not, as his middle name suggests, raised by wolves, but he almost could have been. He was born in 1885 in the tiny mountain town of Beta, North Carolina, to a dad who had worked as a medic for Confederate soldiers in the Civil War and an unmarried housewife who was his dad's fifth wife's niece. So, Brinkley's dad was also technically his step-great-uncle. This is not really that important, but should set the stage nicely. It was Appalachia. Enough said. Brinkley grew up going to a one-room schoolhouse in a log cabin for a few months a year, until he quit school at 16 and began working as a telegraph operator, first at home in rural North Carolina, and later in New York and New Jersey. Both his parents had passed away when he was pretty young, and while Brinkley was away working on telegraph cables, his stepmother passed as well, all because of treatable diseases. This inspired him, or so he later claimed, to act on his childhood dream of becoming a doctor. So, Brinkley and his newlywed wife became doctors, which was pretty much just something you could declare yourself to be in those days. Whether Brinkley ever really wanted to help people or was just in it for the money is sort of unclear, but either way, before long he and his wife came up with the first of many, many grifts. They posed as a Quaker couple, since members of the sect were often seen as good caregivers, and began running a touring medicine show across Appalachia. Medicine shows were a feature of life in 19th century America. They were, effectively, miniature traveling circuses sponsored by quack doctors. Dubious and unregulated miracle cures were a huge business in those days, and people promoting them would do so by bringing elaborate variety shows to little towns. They included musical acts, amateur theater, magic tricks, comedy routines, freak shows, and more, always concluding with a pitch for a particular cure-all medicine. Advertising has supported entertainment since either of the two of them existed. Even Roman gladiators would do product endorsements in the ring. But the medicine shows in the 19th century kind of show just how mainstream fake doctors used to be. Like, you think Dr. Oz is bad? No other industry had such a well-developed advertising network in those days. If you could talk fast and needed to make a buck, anyone could throw some deadly chemicals into a bottle, hire a juggler and a fiddler, and hit the road. Traveling doctors were evaluated not just on whether their treatments worked, but how good of a show they could put on. This was John Brinkley's world. The rest of us were just living in it. I mean, actually, we weren't living back then, but you know. After Brinkley and his wife, Sally, had spent a few years doing medicine shows, they settled down in Chicago, where Brinkley figured it was time to get himself a formal, but not too formal, education. He enrolled at Bennett Medical College, which sounds prestigious enough, but was one of many so-called eclectic medical schools in America at the time. These schools were unaccredited and focused on alternative medicine, which was actually not that different from alternative medicine today. Homeopathy, chiropractors, acupuncture, and herbal remedies. Some of it might even have worked. Either way, though, Brinkley could scarcely afford tuition at Bennett Medical College, and after 2 years of sinking deeper and deeper into debt, he came home one day to find his wife and toddler-aged daughter had set off on their own. Sally contacted him later, but only to file for divorce, to which Brinkley responded by kidnapping their daughter and fleeing to Canada with her. This would end up becoming a theme in John Brinkley's life. When the odds seem against you, pick a nearby national border and jump it. This time around, it kind of worked. With John under another country's jurisdiction, Sally couldn't sue him for alimony and child support, so she called off the divorce and reunited with him. It's not clear how happy Sally was with this arrangement, but she ended up having 2 more daughters over the next few years, and I think that if Brinkley could convince people that they should get goat testicles implanted into them, we'll get there later, I promise, he could convince Sally to get back together with him. Indeed, the picture of John Brinkley that emerges throughout his life story is a person who knows how to get his way in the end, even if he doesn't get there in the way you'd expect. Over the next few years, Brinkley and his growing family went back to doing medicine shows, mostly in the South. He had given up on his dream of getting a medical education, as he was still in debt to Bennett Medical College, but he didn't give up on his dream of getting a medical diploma, and soon he bought one from the Kansas City Eclectic Medical University, where the name really says it all. Ladies, if he has a diploma on his wall from the Kansas City Eclectic Medical University, he's not your man. He's John Goatgland Dr. Brinkley. And Sally took that message to heart. Disgusted at the fact that John was pouring all his time and effort into being a serious con man rather than a small-time medicine show quack, Sally took their now 3 children and dipped, and from then on, she was out of his life for good. More or less. They went to Crawford's hometown, Memphis, Tennessee, where Brinkley met 21-year-old Minnie Jones. Less than a week after Brinkley had arrived in Memphis, they got married, even though John was still legally married to Sally. They had known each other 4 days before getting married. Not engaged, married. Shortly after marrying Minnie Jones, 2 unwelcome groups of people caught up to Brinkley, and he came out victorious over both of them. First, police dragged him back to South Carolina, where he was charged with practicing medicine without a license and writing bad checks. He threw his business partner James Crawford under the bus, saying Crawford had deceived him to the true nature of what they were doing, And he was just a poor boy from North Carolina who didn't know a dang thing about this medicine business. And he managed to be so convincing that police dropped most of the charges against Brinkley, and acting on Brinkley's tip, caught Crawford on the run in Idaho. Crawford ended up settling the charges out of court, paying mostly out of his own pocket. As soon as Brinkley arrived back in Memphis, after his brief legal escapade, he was met by none other than his daughters and his technically not yet ex-wife, Sally, who threatened to expose him for getting married while still married to her. He responded by officially divorcing her. After that, he married Minnie. Again. After practicing medicine with Minnie for a while in Arkansas, Brinkley took a job as a doctor for workers at the Swift & Company slaughterhouse in Kansas City, where his bosses presumably didn't look too hard at his diploma from the Kansas City Eclectic Medical University. While working at the slaughterhouse, Brinkley supposedly, and we are going off John Brinkley's authorized biography here that he paid someone to write, so take this with all the salt in Bolivia, but I think this could be true because how the hell else could he have gotten this idea? Brinkley discovered that of all the animals sent to the slaughterhouse, the goats always seemed to be the healthiest. I don't know what he used as a metric to measure the animal's health, especially because he was supposedly a doctor for humans. He was not a veterinarian. But whether it was because of this or some other factor, Brinkley came away from this job with a firm belief in the vigor and virility of goats. After his stint in Kansas City, Brinkley made his way down to Fulton, Kansas, a town of 416 people near the Missouri border, about 2 hours' drive south of Kansas City. There, he set up a medical practice which was, this time, fairly above the board by his standards. And I mean by his standards. His wife Minnie could boast of a medical degree too, by then, with a diploma that she proudly displayed on her wall, certifying her graduation from the Brinkley Jones Hospital, signed by President John R. Brinkley and Vice President Minnie T. Brinkley. The main event of Brinkley's brief stay in Fulton was a downright Looney Tunes-esque escapade where, allegedly, the Brinkley's pet canary was eaten by none other than the mayor's cat. So, John revived his old redneck roots and shot the cat dead. So then, the mayor of Fulton began editorializing against him in Fulton's newspaper because even towns of 416 people had their own newspapers back then. And Brinkley responded, foreshadowing some of his later hijinks, by running against him for mayor on the very repetitive slogan, "Clean up, clean out, keep clean." Brinkley won by such a substantial margin that the previous mayor, disgraced, sold his newspaper and skipped town. Brinkley didn't do much as mayor, but he did get his revenge over the previous mayor. He didn't serve for very long either. Fulton may have been big enough to have a newspaper, but it wasn't really big enough to need a full-time mayor. At this point, World War I was raging in Europe, and Brinkley was briefly drafted into the Army Reserve, but he fell ill during his 2-month period of service and never left Kansas. I'm not sure I can say for certain whether Brinkley was actually sick at this point, but he was able to convince some army doctors, I guess. After Brinkley was discharged from the army, he answered a newspaper ad calling for a doctor in the small town of Milford, Kansas. And this was the end of the beginning for John R. Brinkley. At this point, his supervillain origin story is complete. Now comes the story of John Brinkley that it's not much of an exaggeration to say nearly every American in the 1920s was familiar with. Everything I just talked about was discovered about him late in his life by lawyers trying to prosecute him. It's all true. There's no doubt about that. But I'd like you to take all that information you just took in about John Brinkley and try to drag it to the trash icon in the corner of your brain. For the parts we're about to talk about, his origins were, by and large, a mystery. Nobody knew anything about his long and sordid backstory at the time he was becoming rich and famous on an empire built of goat gonads. Late in 1917, John and Minnie Brinkley arrived in Milford, Kansas. Nobody in town knew them, but they quickly built up a reputation as decent people, employing several townsfolk on good wages at the clinic they opened in a former soda fountain. Nobody ever claimed that they were doing anything illegal or unethical. In fact, quite the opposite. In 1918, when something very relevant to the medical community began happening, Brinkley gained fame not just in Milford, but in Kansas as a whole for his diligent caregiving. He expanded the size of his clinic to deal with the thing that was happening, made house calls to people suffering from the effects of the event, and was generally exemplary at responding to the thing that required doctors to work really hard for a few years. Sure, some people thought Brinkley's academic credentials were a wee bit suspicious, but it hardly mattered to them. After all, Brinkley was showing that he had some medical talent, possibly for the first and only time in his life. He really did help Milford get through the major historical event, which was probably why people trusted him so much to give him the benefit of the doubt when he embarked on the next stage of his career. In the early 1920s, Brinkley pioneered a very strange surgical procedure. He would take a sliver of the testicular glands from a goat, make a tiny incision in the scrotum of an anesthetized human patient, and implant the goat glands into the patient's balls, just below the skin. The goat gland wasn't attached to anything, and usually it was just absorbed into the patient's system as just another piece of organic matter within a few weeks. Now, it's a little surprising that this didn't cause any negative effects, but totally unsurprising that it didn't cause any positive effects. How Brinkley came to the conclusion that he should do this is still a bit of a mystery. In his deliciously unreliable biography, he illustrates the following scene. One day in 1917, not long after Brinkley had arrived in Milford, a patient came into Brinkley's office complaining that he was unable to get his wife pregnant. While searching through his wares for something that might do the trick, Brinkley spied a pair of goats fucking in Milford's dusty main street. And he joked, "You'd do just fine with a pair of those goat glands in ya." The patient didn't understand it was a joke and begged Brinkley to actually do it, which he did. Now maybe this is really what happened. Maybe Brinkley really would take medical advice from clueless patients who misinterpreted his jokes. The original patient did end up fathering a son a year later, which he credited to the goat gland transplantation, ensuring the procedure's status as Brinkley's signature cure-all. But that son grew up to claim that, actually, Brinkley paid the first patient to let Brinkley perform this experimental surgery on him. This is more plausible, and I don't know why Brinkley would have made up that other story, because I feel like this story actually paints Brinkley in a better light, Paying people for the right to experiment on them is something real doctors do. Whereas trying a really weird experimental surgery on a whim because of a bad joke is something that, maybe doctors also did back then. He poured all the money he'd made from being Milford's doctor into an aggressive ad campaign, including what may have been the world's first use of junk mail. Nobody had had the idea of sending just ads through the mail before until one morning around 1920, when thousands of homeowners across Kansas found their mailboxes stuffed with flyers. They bore a picture of Brinkley holding his first patient's son, appropriately named Billy after the billy goat that made his birth possible, captioned, "He's first goat gland baby." The rather creative use of the English language was a theme that carried through his other promotional material. One flyer said that goat glands would turn an impotent man into, quote, "the ram that am with every lamb." Terrifically confusing collisions of words notwithstanding, Brinkley's fame grew and grew. People from all across the Midwest came to Brinkley's clinic in Milford, seeking to cure their bedroom issues with the power of billy goat balls. Brinkley began charging patients $750 for the procedure, which would be about $10,000 today, but even at those prices, he got several customers a day. Farmers in the Milford area made bank selling goats to Brinkley, and some patients would even show up with their own goats, asking Brinkley to transplant the testes from that specific goat into their own genitalia. Patients who brought their own goat would get a discount. He claimed thousands of satisfied customers, and his flyers, which kept landing on more and more Americans' doorsteps, were full of glowing testimonials from possibly real people who were finally able to have a child after being goat-glanded. In 1921, as John Brinkley's reputation as the goat-gland genius of Milford, Kansas, spread across the nation, he was invited to perform his signature procedure in front of well-known doctors at a hospital in Chicago. Unfazed by the prospect of his thoroughly illegitimate medical practice getting attention from the legitimate medical world, he accepted the invitation, and in front of the press and the medical elite of Chicago, he implanted goat nuts into a judge, the chancellor of the Chicago Law School, an alderman, which is the wonderfully classy, Chicago-specific, as far as I know, word for Chicago City Council members, and 31 other high-class patients. This demonstration received rave reviews from doctors and the public alike, although he slunk rapidly back to Kansas afterward when the authorities discovered he didn't have a medical license. When a local newspaper editorialized against Brinkley, calling his qualifications illegitimate, Brinkley sent him a goat. Power move. The next year, the owner of the Los Angeles Times invited Brinkley out to California, where he was tasked with goat-glanding one of the paper's head editors. If he succeeded, the LA Times' owner promised that he would publicize Brinkley's business nationwide. While Brinkley was in LA, silent film stars lined up to get Rocky Mountain oysters sewn into their own oysters, proving that celebrities' interest in loopy alternative medical treatments is something that has stayed constant throughout the ages. If Gwyneth Paltrow were around then, she would probably have entered into a business partnership with John Brinkley. Brinkley's influence in Hollywood lingered even after he had returned to Kansas. Buster Keaton's silent slapstick comedy Cops features a scene in which a man is kicked out of a doctor's office where a sign reads "Goat Gland Specialist," and the term goat glanding became a short-lived turn of phrase meaning sticking anything onto anything. There's a whole subgenre of so-called goat gland films from around then, which are silent films that have had sound sections added on after they were finished in order to capitalize on the new technology of sound films. He was such a household name back then that when people decided to add sound segments to silent films, they were like, that's kind of like putting goat glands in people. Brinkley returned to Kansas, having been inspired by witnessing early mass media taking shape in California, and he decided that he would publicize his booming balls business even further by starting a radio station. This, too, was a huge innovation. Radio wasn't used all that much for advertising at the time. The technology was in its infancy, and the main use of radio around then was for military and maritime communications. To the extent that radio was used for entertainment purposes, It was only to broadcast sports games, and occasionally plays or concerts going on at theaters in big cities. Brinkley's radio station, KFKB, which he always said stood for Kansas Folks Know Best, was only the fourth mass-market radio station in the entire United States at the time. The first outside of a major city, boasted the world's most powerful radio signal at the time, and was the first to really define what a radio station format could be. It was essentially an adaptation of the old medicine shows for a new century. In addition to Brinkley's diatribes on the miraculous properties of goat hoo-haws, KFKB featured stand-up comedy, storytelling, and performances by local bands and singers, the first time country music was ever broadcast on the radio. Listeners never knew what was coming next. In other words, it was a lot like Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities, if Tor's Cabinet was constantly interrupted by ads for the surgical implantation of farm animal genitalia. But as the menacing music suggests, you don't become this powerful without making a few enemies. Not every doctor in the 1920s was a complete moron. And even though Brinkley had gotten some positive attention from doctors in Chicago, the American Medical Association had had a skeptical eye on him from the moment he started advertising. At the time, the AMA was headed up by a man named Morris Fishbein, who it's hard not to see as the tailor-made villain in the hero's journey story that Brinkley clearly believed his life was. Fishbein was bald, as most villains are. He was relentless, dedicating years of his life to taking Brinkley down. And he hated alternative medicine to a frankly ridiculous extent. Sure, putting goat testicles in people and telling them it's going to heal them is bad. But Fishbein took everything a step beyond where it should have gone. He seemed to believe that he had been put on this earth to cleanse it of quacks and charlatans. His fervor was downright religious. Ultimately, Fishbein may have been the good guy in this story, but he had such a villain vibe. But the American Medical Association wasn't nearly as powerful back then. It was a long way from becoming the cartel it is today, limiting the number of medical licenses that can be awarded in a year. At the time, there were lots of competing standards for doctors in the US. You could get a medical license in some states that wasn't valid in other states, and even diploma mill eclectic medical universities had some level of legitimacy. The AMA was just another one of those competing standards. While Fishbein was successful at getting Brinkley's license to practice medicine in California revoked and an arrest warrant sent out for him after his Hollywood adventure, when police came from California to arrest Brinkley in Kansas, the governor of Kansas personally intervened to free Brinkley, saying that Brinkley's practice was too economically valuable to the state of Kansas for him to be arrested. And there was a point there. Milford was, without exaggeration, the city that John Brinkley built. He paid for his rapidly growing little town to have state-of-the-art electrical and sewage systems, a brand new post office, and even a minor league baseball team called the Brinkley Goats. Brinkley hired a charismatic preacher to, quote, broadcast fundamentalist doctrines and denounce evolutionists, his words, not mine, in the town park every Sunday. Brinkley was going to start a zoo for Milford, too, with a bear that he bought off a circus passing through, but one night, the bear's roaring bothered Brinkley so much that he went outside and shot it. So much for the zoo. Either way, Brinkley was selling much more than just goat gland surgeries at this point. Medicines with his brand on them, all of them equally fraudulent, were being licensed to pharmacies across the country. Many drugstores would proudly display the words, John Brinkley's Remedies Sold Here, in their windows. Brinkley was named an admiral in the honorary fraternal organization, the Kansas Navy. Get it? 'Cause Kansas is landlocked? People were funny in the 1920s. intended to celebrate the most distinguished Kansas residents. Today, the Kansas Navy is defunct, and its only real remaining claim to fame is that John Brinkley was a member of it. Brinkley went on a world tour, visiting China, which was in such a state of chaos at the time that he was able to bribe the guards at the old imperial palace in Beijing to let him steal a priceless ancient silk robe. On the same trip, he went to Egypt, where a fortune teller predicted that he would have a son, and to Switzerland, where he demonstrated his technique to some of Europe's top docs. In 1927, Brinkley's wife Minnie, sure enough, gave birth to a son, John Brinkley Jr., who they called Johnny Boy. Some people speculated that since the Brinkleys didn't appear to have any other children, and John's pre-1917 background was still unknown, John Brinkley might have been impotent himself, and cured via his own remedy. While Brinkley would definitely have milked this for all it was worth if it were true, he denied that his balls contained any goat matter. All this while, behind the scenes, Fishbein was plotting. He had decided that the best way to take Brinkley down was to deplatform and demonetize him. In other words, he was going to take KFKB off the air, and he was not going to stop until he'd done it. Here, he found a worthwhile ally, the newly founded Federal Radio Commission. The commission, which was later to become the FCC, had been founded to rein in the unregulated world of radio. But at the time, they were still working out what would be allowed and what wouldn't on the airwaves. Fishbein contacted them. I'd like to believe that he slowly crept out of the shadows at one of their meetings and said, "Greetings, gentlemen." And he stated his case that they should do something about Brinkley. While the Radio Commission bureaucrats were unswayed by his argument that Brinkley was promoting unscientific and dangerous medical treatments on air, they were drawn to another part of Fishbein's argument. Brinkley talked about sex on the radio. Because he did, of course. Have you tried talking about an impotence cure involving goat testicles without alluding to sex? Go ahead, try it. I dare you. I mean, I'm feeling some solidarity with John Brinkley right now because I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to monetize this episode. Damn you, Fishbein! So that was not okay. And the Radio Commission announced that they would not be renewing KFKB's radio license when it came up for renewal in 1930. This marked the first time the government attempted to impose a moral code on radio broadcasters, a power that they continue to have today, as well as the first time the American Medical Association was able to influence public policy. So, in other words, the AMA and the FCC both became what they are today by deplatforming Brinkley. You can directly trace the AMA's control over medicine in America and the FCC's control over radio back to the time they joined forces to crush Dr. Gonads. Brinkley wasn't going down without a fight. He sued the Federal Radio Commission and ended up trekking all the way from Milford to Washington, D.C. for his court hearing, accompanied by an entire chartered train, which he had paid for, full of well-wishers, various Kansas residents, as well as hundreds of men who had gotten goat glands zipped into their scroti and had no regrets. Despite the protests of this small army of supporters, Brinkley lost the trial and was stripped of his radio license. Around the same time, the Kansas Medical Board convened and, with Fishbein's testimony, decided to also strip Brinkley of his medical license, which I assume they decided after seeing his diploma. Brinkley's medical hearing was overseen by Kansas Attorney General William A. Smith. Remember that guy's name for later. In just a few months, Brinkley had gone from one of the most respected men in America, with millions in the bank and the most listened to radio station in the country, to a disgraced quack who, in the words of the Kansas Medical Board, has perfected an organized charlatanism quite beyond the invention of the humble mountebank. I mean, shit! It's not every day that you get called something worse than a mountebank. Brinkley's last broadcast on KFKB was addressed to his son, Johnny Boy, and sounded alarmingly like he was planning to end his life.
Johnny Boy, this is Daddy talking to you. Daddy is sitting here and making this record because I believe that you would like to hear Daddy's voice after he is gone. I have longed to hear the voice of my own daddy, who passed away when I was just 10 years of age. And as I stood by his unfilled grave, in my little heart of hearts I resolved to be a doctor, which required many years of hard work. So when you came, Daddy did not want you, Johnny, to be left in the condition he was. Daddy has things mapped out for you in the future so that you can have a good education, a college education. And Daddy is speaking to you from the depth of his heart because you are my only little boy. You're Mama's only little boy, and you're the only little boy that we ever expect to have. And Johnny Boy, this talk to you comes to a close, and when Daddy's gone and you hear it, I want you to know that it's given to you with all the love of a loving father. Goodbye.
But it wasn't the end for Dr. John Romulus Brinkley. Offing yourself? Janky. Running for office? Swanky. Brinkley decided to run for governor of Kansas in the 1930 election. Now, it seemed like the odds would be against him from the start. The election was already underway. It was September, and the Democratic and Republican nominees had already been decided. What's more, the ballots were already being printed, so Brinkley didn't even have a chance at getting on the ballot as an independent. He had to run a write-in campaign, and he entered the election right after his name had been plastered across headlines from coast to coast for having his medical and radio licenses stripped for malpractice. But Brinkley had a trick up his sleeve: the Great Depression. The October 1929 stock market crash was less than a year before, and America was suffering through the worst economic crisis it had ever known. Republicans, who held all the levers of power in D.C. at the time of the crash, were widely blamed for the chaos, but in addition to this translating into a wave of support for Democrats, it also meant that Americans were looking for something, anything new, something that represented a break from two-party politics as usual. It was the high water mark for socialism in America, for example, but also the high water mark for fascism in America. Brinkley didn't easily fit into one of those political boxes. In fact, it was never particularly clear what he supported. At his campaign stops, he spoke of vague, anodyne, sticking up for the little man populism, the sort of thing every politician says about taking America back from big business and the special interests. It's quite possible that Brinkley had never put a thought to politics before this. He did have some concrete policy proposals, but they were terrifically odd. He wanted, for example, to put a state lake in every county in Kansas. I'm not sure what a state lake is, but I'm guessing it's a lake maintained by the state. And seeing as most counties in Kansas don't have any lakes at all, he was proposing digging lake beds in dozens of rural Kansas counties. An interesting, but not totally crazy, use of taxpayer dollars during an economic depression. You know, a lot of economists say that during a depression is the best time to build dubiously useful infrastructure projects like that, because even if the lakes themselves don't have any economic value, it gives people jobs. But Brinkley had a weirder justification for this. He thought that the lakes did have economic value. He claimed that the evaporation from the lakes would water Kansans' crops and make them grow faster. I don't think it works like that. Most people in Kansas understood why Brinkley was really running for governor, so that he could keep putting goat gonads into people after he was governor. But where Brinkley lacked in substance, he made up for it and then some in campaigning skill. He visited every county in Kansas, which neither his Democratic nor Republican opponent did. He innovated once again on the campaign trail. He's believed to have been the first political candidate anywhere to use a van with loudspeakers to give speeches on the go. Today, the van with a PA system on the roof is a universal visual metaphor for a political campaign, but it all started with John Brinkley. As the election drew closer, it looked like Brinkley might win. The Attorney General of Kansas, William A. Smith, was not having this. He wasn't about to have prosecuted Brinkley and stripped him of his medical license only for Brinkley to become his boss. Right before Election Day, Smith made an unconventional decision, going against decades of precedent for write-in candidates. A vote would only count as being for Brinkley if the voter spelled Brinkley's name correctly and wrote it as J.R. Brinkley. Not John Brinkley or John R. Brinkley, just J.R. Brinkley. Normally, the rule for write-in candidates is, even if it's misspelled, even if they don't write the name correctly, if you can tell who you're trying to vote for, it's counted as valid. While Brinkley did his best to inform voters of Smith's chicanery, there wasn't much he could do, and the election ended up being well and truly stolen from him. He won almost half the counties in Kansas and about a third of the vote, but Democrat Harry H. Woodring came out narrowly ahead. Up to 50,000 votes for Brinkley, which would have given him a comfortable lead, were disqualified for not writing his name the right way. Some people, although they had heard he was running for office, weren't even sure what office he was running for. People also wrote Brinkley in for Senate, the state Supreme Court, and the state Attorney General. Brinkley even got 20,000 write-in votes in neighboring Oklahoma, where people presumably heard by word of mouth that he was running for governor, but weren't aware that he was running for governor of Kansas. Not without cause, Brinkley realized the election had been stolen, and vowed to run again in 1932, since at this point most gubernatorial terms in the U.S. were 2 years, not 4 years. It might have been the only time in Brinkley's life when he was well and truly wronged without doing anything to bring it on himself. He ran again 2 years later and got an even larger share of the vote, but once again, the votes counted as valid put a different candidate ahead, this time the Republican, Alf Landon. The theft wasn't even subtle. This time, reports surfaced of poll watchers, hired by both major parties, showing up at polling places claiming to be Brinkley campaign workers and giving would-be Brinkley voters misleading instructions, quote-unquote reminding them that Brinkley's name was spelled a different way than it was really spelled, or telling voters to write their own name on the ballot below Brinkley's so that vote counters would know there was no fraud. This would actually result in it being declared a spoiled ballot. Now here's a really insane butterfly effect. If you're a history nut, and if you're watching a video about John Brinkley, you're probably a history nut. You might have heard of Alf Landon. That name might ring a bell. 4 years after he stole the election for Kansas governor from John Brinkley, Landon became the worst performing major party presidential nominee in American history when he ran for president as the Republican nominee and lost in a 46-state landslide to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Karma catching up with him? Maybe, but probably not. Roosevelt had instituted the New Deal in his first term and was generally seen as doing a good job fighting the Depression, so he probably would have won a second term either way. But Landon was a terrible campaigner. The only big election he had won before that, governor of Kansas, he won by cheating. so it's fair to say he didn't know how to win a legitimate election. After Landon won the 1936 Republican presidential nomination, he just stayed in Kansas, making no campaign appearances for 2 months. There were no presidential debates in 1936, and Roosevelt ended up crushing Landon with 523 electoral votes to Landon's 8. Now, if Brinkley had beaten Landon in Kansas in 1932, as he would have if all his votes had been counted, Landon probably wouldn't have run for president in 1936. Nobody would want a president who couldn't win against the goat gland doctor. And if Landon hadn't run for president in 1936, then someone else would have been the Republican nominee. Maybe someone who knew a little more about campaigning. Maybe, and we're in real maybe territory here, this is a totally bonkers counterfactual, but maybe someone who was capable of beating Roosevelt. Someone who could convince people that the New Deal wasn't the right course of action. And if FDR had been defeated and became a one-term president and the New Deal was seen as a mistake, well, the Great Depression probably would have gotten even worse from there onward, and who knows what track that could have put the country on. There could have been a socialist revolution in the United States, or a fascist one. Or, if the Republicans had kept on holding power into the 1940s, the U.S. might have stayed neutral in World War II. A lot of Republicans at the time were non-interventionists, as they called themselves. We have no way of knowing what would have changed if Alf Landon hadn't been governor of Kansas, and most likely the differences would have ended with some other Republican losing in a landslide in 36. But if FDR had been beaten against all odds, I can say with some confidence that probably would have been a worse world. So, you know what? You gotta hand it to Alf Landon for beating John Brinkley at his own grifting game. History's screw-ups are as important as history's heroes. Speaking of, Brinkley wasn't done. He decided that if the powers that be wouldn't let him run for office in America, he would skip the country, just like he did in his domestic dispute with Sally so many years ago. At this point, the US and Canada had come to an international agreement on standardizing radio operations, and between them, they took all of the licensed radio frequencies in North America. Mexico was shut out of the agreement, and the Mexican government was yearning for some enterprising American radio operator to come south of the border and target the US with a powerful enough radio station to be heard in both countries, to get them back for hogging all the frequencies. Brinkley was exactly who they needed. The Mexican government promised him startup money and a plot of land just across the Rio Grande from Texas for him to build his radio station. There, Brinkley started XERA, which is still to this day the strongest radio station there has ever been. In Brinkley's day, it broadcasted at 1 million kilowatts from its 300-foot towers. Stories spread of birds being sizzled out of the sky by the radio waves. And the Carter family, a country band who regularly performed on Brinkley's shows, half-joked that you could hear their music on every barbed wire fence in Texas. Anything made of a conductive material in northern Mexico and the south-central U.S. picked up XERA. People complained about Brinkley's mile-a-minute speeches vibrating the fillings in their teeth. People who had braces heard it louder and clearer. If you were close enough to the border, you could listen in with your bed springs, ceiling fans, and yes, barbed wire fences. And it was audible, though not quite as unavoidably, across most of North America, meaning the US government hadn't done what they hoped in shutting Brinkley out. He was still on the radio, getting a substantial following and millions of dollars a year, talking about goat gonads and sex and all these other wild things now too, because he was now selling space on XERA to other hucksters. It wasn't just Brinkley advertising his goat surgery anymore. There were other people advertising other things on Brinkley's station now, including, quote, crazy water crystals, genuine simulated diamonds, and, I'm not kidding, autographed photos of Jesus Christ, signed either in ink or, if you paid extra, blood. He also launched the careers of some other rather more legitimate entertainers too. Country stars like Gene Autry, Jimmy Rogers, and the aforementioned Carter family. During this time, Brinkley lived not in Mexico, but in the town of Del Rio, Texas, over across the border from XERA's massive antennas. Brinkley's studio was in Texas too, and he would send his live broadcasts over across the border to the XERA antennas. In response, the Senate passed the Radio Act of 1934, which is still in effect to this day and remains one of the most consequential laws the U.S. government has ever passed, regulating radio. One clause in it was specifically created to take down Brinkley, banning the transmission of sound intended for a radio broadcast across U.S. borders. Brinkley changed his strategy slightly after this, but only slightly. He began pre-recording his broadcasts on vinyl records, putting them in a truck and shipping them across the border, making him the first radio operator to pre-record broadcasts. That way no sound was getting transmitted, right? And so, Brinkley built back his empire in Del Rio, Texas. He didn't have a medical license anymore, but he was allowed to run a clinic where other people would perform his legendary goat gland surgery, and he built back his fortune as both a radio operator and a doctor. Because of Brinkley, Del Rio became a bona fide entertainment center, nicknamed the Hillbilly Hollywood. All the big country stars went there to get broadcasted on XERA. There are claims from around this time that Brinkley had become a Nazi sympathizer. His opulent mansion in Del Rio had a pool tiled in swastikas, which were just a cool symbol for a long time, but by the late 1930s, definitely raised some eyebrows. But his wife Minnie also campaigned for John Nance Garner, FDR's vice president, who was from the same part of Texas where the Brinkleys now lived. Again, I don't think Brinkley ever had strong political opinions at all. He certainly didn't talk about politics as much as he did about goat gonads. I think his position was something like, the vice president's from around here. We should support him. As for those Nazis, I've seen them in the newsreels, and they've got a swell logo. Eventually, though, Fishbein caught up with him. In 1938, Fishbein published a 2-part series called Modern Medical Charlatans, which purported to be a who's who of everyone getting up to shenanigans in the medical industry at the time, but was really just a personal attack on Brinkley. Brinkley, understandably believing that he was unstoppable by this point, sued Fishbein for libel, which ended up being the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Brinkley was effectively putting himself on trial. At this point, broadcasting his goat gland ads alongside other nonsense like autographed photos of Jesus, it was easier to paint Brinkley as the sheer fraud that he was. And very quickly, a jury found that Fishbein was not guilty at all of libeling Brinkley. All the things he said were true. At this point, Brinkley's entire sordid past was laid bare, all its juicy details dug up by Fishbein's expensive lawyers. All the claims Brinkley had made in his hagiographic, authorized biography were disproven. He had lied about basically everything. People saw Brinkley for who he really was at long last, and the verdict unleashed a barrage of lawsuits against him for malpractice. Some of these came from people who were no less opportunistic than Brinkley himself, people who had been originally satisfied with the care they'd gotten from Brinkley, deciding they could now get a lot of money from suing him because now the courts had said he was a crook. After this, Brinkley lost his entire fortune, his hospital in Del Rio closed down, and he entered a period of poor health, after which he passed away penniless in Texas, 1942, with many lawsuits against him still pending. For all the cheating and lying and defrauding and swastika tiling and goat gland implanting, I think it's hard not to feel a little bit sorry for John R. Brinkley. Here was one of the most successful and unusual men of the early 20th century, brought to a point of utter ruin by people who were ultimately not a lot more honest than he was. You have to appreciate someone who had the balls, pun intended, to pick such an odd path in life and make a multi-million-dollar career out of it, especially from such destitute beginnings. But John Brinkley is not really dead. As long as we remember him, his memory lives on in all the things he invented or pioneered, from talk radio to junk mail to border blaster radio stations, which are still going strong along the U.S.-Mexican border today. Brinkley's own XERA, while it never broadcast at such a crazy high volume ever again, it was taken over by the legendary 50s DJ Wolfman Jack, who helped popularize rock and roll. Brinkley's legacy lives on in many, mostly annoying, ways. There should be a museum dedicated to this guy, maybe back in his hometown of Milford, Kansas. Except that the original town site of Milford is no longer inhabited because it was flooded under the waters of Milford Reservoir, created in the 60s on the grounds that what Kansas really needed was more lakes.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. A loaded question will break your bones. What puts you on your knees? You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart. But the man in gray will get you now. You've got to hide or take the blame. One